10 years ago he vanished. Now he's back. And the kids she's been raising all have his face. He came back on a Tuesday afternoon, not with a grand gesture or sweeping apology, but in an old pickup truck coated with dust and the weight of 10 silent years. The house was smaller than he remembered. The paint chipped the windows dull, but it was still standing still there like her. James Whitmore hadn't spoken to Grace Holloway since the day he walked away, leaving behind more than just a woman, leaving behind 3 lives that didn't know his name. He had built empires in the time since signed contracts worth millions been praised, envied, hated. But none of it mattered now. What haunted him wasn't the money or the legacy. It was the echo of a child's voice he had never heard, the sound of laughter he had never deserved. As he stood at the threshold, clutching the envelope that ended his reign as a billionaire, he didn't know what would hurt more, her silence or the eyes of the children he never raised. But he knocked, and he waited. Because this time, he wasn't leaving. The tires crunched against the gravel as James Whitmore's truck rolled to a stop just beyond the crooked fence line of the old house he'd once promised never to return to. Kentucky air felt different, thicker somehow, humid with memory, heavy with the kind of silence that carried unfinished words and unforgiven choices. 10 years. He had been gone a full decade, buried in boardrooms, private jets, and billion-dollar decisions, all designed to distract him from the one truth he could no longer outrun. He had left her. He had left them. The trees still swayed the same way, their rustling reminding him of nights on that porch, her voice humming while the world felt small and safe. Now everything felt enormous, fragile. He didn't tell anyone he was coming back. Not his assistant, not his lawyer, not even himself, until the morning he packed his entire life into the back of that truck and drove south. The further he went, the more everything stripped away. Titles. Ego, ambition. By the time he reached the dirt road leading to Grace's house, all that remained was a man no longer a mogul who had traded his fortune for a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. James stepped out of the truck and found himself staring at the weathered front porch of a house that had haunted his dreams for years. It was smaller than he remembered, the paint peeled back by seasons he hadn't stayed to witness, the swing missing one chain like a broken memory left swaying in the wind. And yet, it was hers, Grace's. The woman he once loved so fiercely it terrified him. The woman he abandoned without a goodbye. He had written 1,000 letters in his mind on the long drive south, but now standing in front of her door, every word dissolved. All that remained was the echo of guilt and the unbearable weight of knowing she had raised 3 children without him. Children who bore his blood, his eyes, maybe even his laugh, though he had never heard it. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the crumpled envelope containing the signed sale of his company, the final severance from the life he thought he wanted. He wasn't here to fix things with money. He wasn't here to make speeches. He was here because this house and the woman inside held everything he had once been too much of a coward to face. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and there she was. Grace Holloway, framed in the doorway like a memory he'd never been able to bury. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even gasp. Her eyes, once soft and full of fire, now held the cool, unreadable stillness of someone who had long since stopped expecting answers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was brutal, louder than any scream. James opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing that no arrangement of words could shrink the chasm between them. Her gaze moved over him, not with affection or hate, but with the quiet detachment of a woman who had carried her pain alone for too long to share it now. It struck him then he was not returning home to someone waiting. He was standing before a stranger who had once known his heartbeat. The space between them was heavy with everything unspoken: betrayal, abandonment, the birthdays missed, the promises broken. And still she didn't speak. She simply looked at him, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the ghost she had finally stopped dreaming about. She didn't shout, didn't demand explanations, didn't reach for the door to slam it in his face. Instead, Grace stood there with the kind of stillness that made James feel colder than any fury ever could. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, but her entire body was locked in quiet tension, as if bracing for an earthquake she refused to acknowledge. There was no bitterness in her tone because she didn't offer him words at all. Just that look, that devastating, unreadable look that said you don't belong here anymore. James had expected anger, maybe even a slap across the face, something he could absorb and say, "I deserve that." But what he found was worse. An emptiness, a controlled distance that told him whatever fire had once lived in her had been doused long ago by years of silence and survival. The woman he remembered, the one who used to laugh freely, who once danced barefoot in the rain, was now a silhouette of resolve and self-preservation. She wasn't protecting her heart from him anymore. She had simply built a life that no longer included him, and she wasn't about to tear it down just because the past had decided to knock. James didn't lower his head or beg for forgiveness. He didn't even offer the apology that had rehearsed itself in his mind 1,000 times. Instead, he looked at her straight into the eyes that no longer softened for him and said quietly, "I can't run anymore." The words hung there fragile and heavy, like a confession too worn to carry grace. Grace didn't react at first. Not a blink, not a shift in her posture. But something in her breath changed, a pause, a flicker barely perceptible unless you'd once known the rhythm of her silence. It wasn't an admission of guilt in his tone, not yet. It was simply a truth raw and unvarnished. He had run from her, from the weight of fatherhood, from a version of himself he wasn't brave enough to face. He had buried himself in skyscrapers and boardrooms trying to outrun the echo of 3 tiny heartbeats he never held. But now the running had turned to rot, and standing here in front of the only woman who had ever truly seen him, he realized this wasn't about asking to be let in. It was about not hiding anymore, about showing up even if she didn't want him there, especially because she didn't. She didn't say a word, didn't invite him in. With the same measured calm that had become her armor, Grace slowly closed the door, not in anger, but with a finality that stung deeper than rage. The soft thud of the wood clicking into place felt like a verdict, like the echo of 10 years crashing shut on everything he had hoped to reclaim. James didn't move. He didn't call out or knock again. Instead, he sat down on the worn wooden steps of the porch, the same steps where they used to drink sweet tea and plan futures he'd never stayed to build. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, bleeding amber and gold across the sky, casting long shadows that stretched toward him like memories reaching out. He rested his elbows on his knees, fingers-laced eyes fixed on the ground. Time slowed. The air smelled of pine and dust and something else, something quieter. Regret. He didn't know if she would open the door again or if the children inside would ever know who he was. But he stayed. As dusk settled and the cicadas began to hum, James remained seated beneath the falling light, determined not to leave this time, no matter how long it took. From the shadowed corner of the living room, Ellie sat cross-legged behind the faded floral curtain, a dull pencil gripped tightly in her fingers, her sketch pad balanced on her knees. The sun had already dipped low, but the last threads of golden light spilled through the window, just enough to cast the outline of the man sitting outside onto the wall. She didn't blink. Every few seconds, her eyes darted from his hunched silhouette to the page, capturing the slope of his shoulders, the way his hands hung loosely between his knees, the tension in his neck like a string pulled too tight. He hadn't moved in nearly an hour. That told her more than words ever could. Most people fidgeted when they waited. They checked their phone, they muttered to themselves, they paced. But not him. He just sat like he was rooted to the spot, like leaving wasn't even a question. Ellie didn't know who he was, but something about him felt like a question she'd been living with her whole life. She shaded in the creases of his coat, softened the angles of his jaw. She wasn't drawing a stranger anymore. She was trying to remember someone she had never met, and part of her already knew the answer. Jonah sat quietly on the 3rd step of the staircase, his small fingers curled tightly around the wooden banister, his chin resting just above the railing. From his perch, he had the perfect view of the front door's narrow side window, the one where the man's figure could still be seen unmoving, bathed in the dimming light of early evening. Jonah didn't speak. He never did. Not to anyone outside of his mother and his sister. Words for him were too fragile, too slow to keep up with what he felt. but his eyes were wide, dark, and still absorbing every detail like a sponge pressed against a secret. The man outside didn't knock again. He didn't yell or call out. He just sat. That puzzled Jonah. People who came to their house always wanted something. They asked questions, offered fake smiles, tried too hard. But this one didn't do anything. He just waited. And for some reason Jonah couldn't explain that stillness made him stay frozen too. He didn't move from his step. He didn't look away. Something deep in his chest, quiet and old and wordless, told him this wasn't just a visitor. It was something else. Someone else. And though Jonah didn't understand what it meant, he knew it mattered. Under the worn oak table that had become her secret castle, 6-year-old Maisie sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her head tilted slightly as she stared toward the front window, her fingers absently tracing circles in the dust along the floor. The grown-ups always thought she didn't notice things, that her world was made of dolls and daydreams. But Maisie saw more than they realized. She had seen her mother's hands tremble slightly when she closed the door, had caught the way her sister froze like a statue behind the curtain, and had noticed Jonah still as a stone on the stairs, watching, listening, feeling. Maisie hugged her knees tighter and whispered barely loud enough for the silence to hear, "Who's the man outside?" Her voice drifted upward, unnoticed, until she repeated it louder, a little braver. "Mama, who is that man?" No answer came. Just the ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, and the strange heaviness that filled the room like fog. Maisie squinted, trying to see the man's face more clearly through the window. He didn't look scary. He looked tired. Sad. Like someone who had lost something and didn't know how to ask for it back. She leaned forward and asked again, softly but certain, "Is he lost?" Grace stood in the kitchen, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, eyes fixed on the shadow of the man still sitting on the porch. Her children's questions lingered in the air like smoke, soft, persistent, inescapable. She didn't turn to face them. She didn't need to. They were listening from their usual corners. Ellie behind the curtain, Jonah on the stairs, Maisie curled under the table like a secret she hadn't meant to speak aloud. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet but unwavering, carrying the weight of a decade's silence. "He's not a stranger," she said, more to the room than to any one child. "He's someone who once chose to leave you." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, not because they weren't true, but because they were too true. She could have spared them. She could have lied or said it more gently. But she was done wrapping pain in pretty paper. Her children had lived with enough unanswered questions. They deserved truth, even the kind that stung. Her fingers gripped the counter tighter. She didn't want them to hate him. She just needed them to know that love didn't always mean staying. And sometimes the ones who leave come back, not because they deserve to, but because they finally understand what they lost. The house felt heavier after Grace spoke, as if the truth itself had settled into the walls and pulled everything quiet. Ellie lowered her pencil but didn't look up from her drawing, her heart thudding in a rhythm she couldn't sketch her way out of. Jonah shifted on the stair, pulling his knees closer to his chest, his eyes wide and uncertain, his silence now louder than any question. Maisie curled tighter under the table, her earlier curiosity replaced with a strange stillness, like she was waiting for someone to say it was all just a story. None of them spoke, but they all felt it, that strange twisting of something between hope and hurt, confusion and curiosity. Hate would have been easier, clean and sharp, like the stories where villains leave and heroes protect. But this wasn't that kind of story. This was a story with missing pages and quiet scars, a man who wasn't dead, but hadn't stayed a name they didn't know how to carry. They didn't know if they were supposed to feel angry or excited or scared. All they knew was that the man outside wasn't a stranger anymore, and that changed everything. Hope flickered like a match. So did doubt. And none of them were ready to choose. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills of Kentucky, casting a pale golden light across the dewy fields and the weathered porch where James still sat, unmoved from the spot he'd claimed the night before. His back ached from the hard step, his legs stiff from hours without rest, but he didn't shift, didn't yawn, didn't stretch. Not because he wasn't exhausted, but because something deeper than comfort kept him rooted there. His suit jacket was draped over his shoulders like a blanket damp with the chill of dawn. The sky was a watercolor of soft pinks and grays, and in that quiet hour before the world stirred awake, he listened. To the creak of the wooden beams above his head, to the wind brushing through the leaves, to the distant bark of a dog. But most of all, he listened for signs of life inside the house. Footsteps, voices, anything. Grace hadn't opened the door again. She hadn't brought a blanket or even looked through the window. Yet James remained because staying was the only thing he had left to offer. The man who had once vanished into boardrooms and silence was now choosing stillness not to be dramatic, but to prove something words never could. That he wasn't running. That he would wait for as long as it took for the door, or a voice, or even just one child's gaze to meet his own. The screen door creaked open just after sunrise, not loudly but enough to stir James from his trance-like stillness. He didn't turn his head, he didn't dare, but he knew it was her. Grace stepped onto the porch with slow, measured steps, the kind that made no announcement but carried the weight of 10 years anyway. In her hand she held a plain white mug, steam curling gently from its rim like a fragile offering. She didn't look at him. Her eyes remained focused on the porch floorboards as she approached her movements, calm, deliberate, distant. When she stopped beside him, she didn't speak, didn't sigh, didn't ask if he had slept. Instead, she crouched slightly and placed the coffee beside him on the third step, exactly 1 inch from his hand, then stood and turned, without a word. Her dress rustled softly in the morning air as she walked back toward the door, the sound more intimate than any sentence they could have exchanged. James didn't reach for the mug right away. He watched the steam rise his throat, tightening with something he couldn't name. That cup of coffee wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't conversation. But it was something. A crack in the wall, a sign he hadn't been invisible all night. He watched her disappear behind the door again, slower this time, not slamming it shut. And even though she didn't say anything, the message was clear. She hadn't asked him to leave. Not yet. And that was enough for now. The second time the door opened that morning, it wasn't Grace, it was Ellie. James heard the soft click of the latch and instinctively sat up straighter, heart skipping like it hadn't in years. The door creaked just enough for a small figure to emerge barefoot, her long dark hair slightly tousled from sleep, but her eyes impossibly sharp. She didn't say anything. She just stood in the doorway, framed by the morning light, with a sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest, and a gaze far too old for her 10 years. James recognized those eyes, instantly eyes that had once belonged to a woman who used to look at him the same way back when love was still simple and promises were unbroken. Ellie stepped onto the porch, not approaching him, just observing. Her stare wasn't hostile, but it wasn't soft either. It was the kind of look a child gives a puzzle with missing pieces, not knowing whether to solve it or walk away. She tilted her head, narrowed her gaze as if trying to match the man before her to a drawing she'd seen in a dream or a story only half remembered. James didn't speak. He didn't dare. The moment was too fragile, too sacred. After a long, silent beat, Ellie turned without a word, reached for the door and closed it gently behind her. Not slamming it, not locking it, just closing it. And in that quiet act, James felt something shift. She hadn't smiled, hadn't said his name, but she'd looked. Really looked. And somehow that look held more weight than any conversation he could have begged for. There were no words exchanged, no dramatic confessions, no sudden outpouring of emotion, but something had shifted, however imperceptibly, and James felt it in the quiet air between the door and the porch. The silence wasn't as cold now, not as punishing. It had taken on a different shape, not empty, but expectant like the hush before the first note of a song. He sat there, still coffee cooling beside him, his back aching more than before, but his breath felt less like waiting and more like something was unfolding. Grace hadn't said a word. Ellie hadn't asked a single question, but their actions, subtle, careful, deliberate, carried the weight of decisions being made in real time. A cup of coffee, a look through the door, a child's quiet stare. These were not just gestures. They were threads, tentative ones, being tugged toward something fragile but real. James knew better than to move too quickly. He had shattered things once with impatience and pride. Now he understood that presence itself was the offering, that trust wasn't given in moments but rebuilt over days of simply staying. He didn't know if tomorrow would bring more silence or the sound of a voice finally breaking through. But for now, the porch no longer felt like exile. It felt like a beginning, not forgiveness, not welcome, but the faintest trace of maybe. And that after 10 years of running was everything. On the fourth morning, James stood up before the sun did, joints stiff and hands slightly trembling from a decade of desk work that had softened him more than he liked to admit. He looked up at the leaking porch roof, the warped wooden slats and rusted nails barely holding together the one place that had offered him shelter since his return. It had dripped all night, soft taps like a ticking clock counting down something he couldn't name. Without asking, without announcing it to anyone inside, James went to the back of the house and rummaged through the old shed, the same one he remembered helping Grace's father clean out back when they were barely more than kids. He found a bent hammer, a coffee can of mismatched nails, and some warped planks stacked under a tarp. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin. By the time the sky turned gold, he was on a ladder, sleeves rolled up, jaw clenched with focus. His hands awkward at first, but steadying with each nail driven into soft wood. He wasn't fixing the roof to earn praise or to make a grand gesture. He was doing it because it needed doing, and because this porch, this small, creaking piece of a life he once abandoned, had held him while he waited. Inside, Grace must have heard the soft rhythm of hammer against nail, but she didn't come out. Still, she didn't stop him either. And that silent permission, that absence of resistance, was all James needed. For the first time in years, his hands were building instead of walking away. The school bus rumbled down the gravel road just after 7, its engine coughing in protest as it rolled to a stop at the end of the long driveway. The morning light stretched in pale ribbons across the porch where James stood wiping sweat from his brow and brushing wood dust off his jeans. He paused as he heard the front door creak open, followed by the soft shuffle of small feet and the low murmur of Grace ushering the children out. He didn't turn, didn't wave. He knew he hadn't earned that kind of familiarity yet. But he stood still, instinctively straightening his posture as the 3 small figures emerged. Maisie darted out first, clutching her lunchbox with a stuffed rabbit's ear sticking out the side. Jonah followed closely behind, silent as ever, eyes avoiding James entirely as he clung to Grace's side. Ellie came last. She didn't say anything, didn't even slow her pace, but as she reached the bus steps, she glanced back. Just once. Through the smudged window of the school bus, her eyes met his, not long enough to smile, not long enough to read, but long enough to hold. It wasn't a look of forgiveness or affection, but it wasn't indifference either. It was recognition. She had seen him up there on the ladder, hammer in hand, not asking to be seen, but not hiding anymore. As the bus pulled away, kicking up dust behind it, James exhaled, a strange weight pressing on his chest. That brief glance through glass stayed with him longer than any word could have. He wasn't invisible. And for now, that was enough. That evening, as the sky bled into soft lavender and the crickets began to hum in the tall grass, James walked slowly toward the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, a place that had once been the children's kingdom long before he had ever dared to return. He remembered the swing that used to hang from its thickest branch, the way it creaked when Grace laughed, the way he used to push her barefoot through summer dusk. Now the branch hung bare, weathered rope long gone, a single rusted hook, the only sign of what had once brought joy. James had found the broken wooden seat behind the shed earlier that day, chipped and forgotten, with initials carved faintly into its underside, GM plus JW, a whisper from a time when everything felt possible. He didn't ask Grace. He didn't knock or announce his plan. He simply got to work. He sanded the seat smooth again, found new rope thick enough to hold a child, and climbed the tree slowly, knees aching, but determined. As the sun dipped behind the hill, he knotted each rope with careful precision, testing the swing before stepping back. He didn't expect applause. He didn't even expect anyone to notice. But just as he began to turn away, a small voice broke the silence. "Is that for me?" Maisie stood barefoot in the grass, her pajama top slightly crooked, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. James knelt, nodded once, and stepped back. She didn't ask questions. She sat, swung gently and whispered, "Mama said it used to fly." James watched the rope sway dusk, catching her silhouette midair, and for the first time since returning he felt something close to hope. As the swing creaked gently in the hush of twilight, the cricket's chorus rising in the distance, Maisie tilted her head slightly, her small hands gripping the edges of the wooden seat like she was afraid the question might blow away if she didn't hold on. Her legs kicked forward, then back toes brushing the grass, and she looked at James with a squint that came not from the fading light, but from the slow and careful way children measure truths too big for their age. He didn't speak, just stood nearby, hands in his pockets, unsure if his presence brought comfort or confusion. Then she asked it, not loudly, not accusingly, but with the aching curiosity of a child who had waited too long for the answer. "Are you my dad?" The words hung in the air like smoke, fragile and sharp. James didn't move at first. His breath caught in his throat. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 different ways, but now that it had arrived raw and real and asked by the smallest voice he'd ever heard, every version he had imagined fell away. He crouched to her level, meeting her eyes, and didn't rush. "Yes," he said quietly, but clearly his voice rasping with the weight of everything he hadn't said in a decade. "I am." Maisie blinked, studying him. Not like a stranger, but like someone trying to match the man in front of her with the shadow her imagination had drawn in bedtime questions and half-answers. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just nodded once slowly and kept swinging her feet, brushing the earth like nothing had changed, yet somehow everything had. James stood in the dimming light, barely breathing as Maisie swung gently before him, her small body silhouetted against the fading sky, her question still echoing in the air like a hymn. He had answered her with trembling honesty, but what lingered wasn't his words. It was the fact that she had asked, that she had looked at him not as an intruder, not as a man who had vanished, but as someone worth wondering about. And that question, so simple, so small in sound, had cracked open something inside him that had been locked away for 10 years. His throat tightened, his chest constricted, and though no tears fell, everything in him trembled with the ache of being seen. Not forgiven, not embraced, but seen. He couldn't speak. There were no words that could match the magnitude of that moment. So instead he let his eyes say what his mouth could not. And in that silence, in that space between a child's innocence and a father's regret, he let gratitude rise like a tide. Gratitude not for a second chance, but for a question. For the courage of a 6-year-old girl to ask what he never dared hope to hear. And in that gaze, moist, unblinking, reverent James offered her everything he had, left the truth of his sorrow, the softness of his longing, and the unspoken promise that from this moment on, he would not run. He would stay. Because she had asked, and in asking she had given him something no one else ever had a reason to believe he still mattered. James stood awkwardly in the small, warmly lit kitchen, the faded recipe card trembling slightly in his hand, as he read over the handwriting, curved and careful, of Grace's late mother. The paper smelled faintly of cinnamon and age corners curled and stained with years of use. It wasn't just a recipe for peach cobbler. It was a memory pressed between the pages of time, and James knew it carried more weight than the ingredients it listed. He'd asked Grace if he could borrow it, and though she hadn't said much, she handed it over with a neutral nod, her eyes unreadable. Now, as he rolled up his sleeves and fumbled with flour, he tried to remember the sounds and smells that once floated through her kitchen when they were young and foolish, and still believed life would go according to plan. The peaches he peeled were ripe, soft, and sticky, their sweetness clinging to his fingers like a whisper of summer afternoons long gone. He burned the first batch of crust and spilled too much vanilla in the mix, muttering curses under his breath, but he didn't give up. Each step was more than cooking. It was his way of apologizing without words, of showing the children he wasn't just a man on the porch anymore. When Jonah peeked through the hallway and Ellie passed by with a glance that lingered half a second longer than usual, James felt a flicker of hope rise through the steam. He wasn't cooking for perfection. He was cooking to be part of something again, to reclaim a place at the table, not just through blood, but through effort, presence, and the warmth of something homemade. Ellie entered the kitchen quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the worn wooden floor, her presence like a shadow sliding across the room. James was bent over the oven checking the crust of the peach cobbler again, afraid it might burn like the first batch. He didn't notice her at first, not until she stepped beside the table and without a word placed a sheet of paper there. It was her latest drawing, no colors this time, just stark pencil lines etched deep into the grain of the paper, as if each stroke carried the weight of what couldn't be said aloud. James turned slowly, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and glanced at the drawing. 3 children stood close together. Ellie, Jonah, and Maisie clearly identifiable in the details of their hair height and stance. Across from them, at a visible distance, stood a solitary man. No features on his face, no lines suggesting closeness or movement, just space. Wide, deliberate space. It hit James harder than words could. The picture said what Ellie never had to you are here, but not yet with us. You exist, but not inside the circle. He looked at her, but she didn't meet his eyes. She just turned and left her silence louder than any confrontation. And James stood frozen, holding a dish towel in one hand and a truth too heavy in the other, realizing that proximity wasn't presence, and being outside wasn't always about where you stood, but how far your heart still had to go. James was sitting on the back steps, wiping the sweat from his brow as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves of the old maple tree, casting golden shadows across the yard. The swing he had rebuilt for Maisie creaked gently in the breeze, the ropes taut, the seat smooth and sanded. He hadn't expected anyone to be out there with him, not yet. But then he heard the faint sound of footsteps on grass, hesitant and light. And when he looked up, Jonah was standing a few feet away, his eyes fixed not on James, but on the swing. The boy's face was unreadable, his arms folded protectively across his small chest, his expression cautious but not cold. They stood in silence for what felt like forever. James afraid to breathe too loudly to break whatever fragile thread was holding this moment together. And then softly, so softly James almost thought he imagined it, Jonah said, "Swing, pretty." 2 words, just 2. But for a boy who had not spoken a full sentence to anyone other than his mother or sister, in as long as anyone could remember, it was a thunderclap in a quiet room. James's eyes widened and he dared not move, not wanting to startle the boy. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat, and whispered, "I'm glad you think so." Jonah didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked slowly back toward the house, but his pace was different, less guarded, more certain. And James sat back down the air, suddenly feeling a little warmer, his heart holding on to those 2 small words, like they were the beginning of a bridge he'd only dreamed of crossing. Grace stood quietly in the kitchen doorway, one hand resting on the frame as she watched the scene unfold through the back window. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hope. Jonah had just turned away from James, and though his face remained its usual guarded mask, there was a softness in his steps, a gentleness in the way he moved that hadn't been there before. Grace had seen it all, the boy's hesitant approach, the whisper of 2 words, and James' still careful, reverent responding not with desperation, but with presence. It wasn't grand or loud or cinematic, but it was real, deeply real, in a way that pierced straight through her defenses. She had spent years building walls to keep the ache out, to shield her children from further abandonment, and to shield herself from the ache of what could have been. But in that moment, watching her son speak to the man who had once walked away, her walls cracked, not because she wanted them to, but because something small and true had slipped through. She blinked hard, tried to turn away to pretend she hadn't seen, but the warmth behind her eyes betrayed her. Her vision blurred, her breath caught. She hadn't cried for James in a decade, but now with no warning she stood motionless as tears quietly welled, not from pain this time, but from the unexpected sting of witnessing a possibility she hadn't dared to believe in. That maybe, just maybe, redemption didn't come all at once. But in moments like this, a soft voice, a swing, a father who finally stayed. Ellie stood at the edge of the porch. Fists clenched, her voice shaking not from fear but from a fury that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface for years. James had just finished replacing a loose board on the steps when he heard her behind him. But before he could turn, her words sliced through the quiet air like a blade. "Why didn't you come when I started first grade?" She snapped, her voice louder than he had ever heard it. "Why weren't you there when Mom was in the hospital and Jonah couldn't stop shaking and Maisie kept asking where the sun went at night like it was going to disappear forever?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "Do you know how many times I cried and prayed and begged for anyone to knock on that door and tell me I wasn't invisible? I waited for you." James froze, turning slowly, his eyes wide, unguarded. Ellie was trembling now, tears welling, but refusing to fall, her small frame rigid with the weight of everything she had carried far too long. "You don't just get to show up and drink coffee on the porch like you never left," she spat. "You left us. You left me. And I want to know why." James opened his mouth, but no words came, only the unbearable truth of silence, too many years of it. Ellie's chest rose and fell as she stared at him, not as a little girl wanting a father, but as someone demanding answers she had earned. And for the first time since his return, James saw in her not only the child he'd missed, but the fierce, grieving fire she had become in his absence. James stood there motionless, the weight of Ellie's words settling over him like a thick, suffocating fog. He didn't look away from her eyes, even as they burned into him with 10 years of unspoken ache. His mouth parted once, but no words came. There was no defense, no excuse that could survive the truth she had just hurled at him. The silence stretched heavy and raw, until finally, in a voice quieter than the wind rustling through the broken screen door, he spoke. "Because I was a coward." The words didn't come like an epiphany. They came like an admission long buried, festering beneath years of guilt. "I left because I was scared," he said, his eyes not wavering from hers. "Scared of being a father. Scared of not being enough. Scared of failing you before I even tried." He swallowed hard, every syllable carving itself out from a decade of shame. "When your mother told me she was pregnant, I told myself I'd come back when I figured it all out. When I had money, when I had answers. But the longer I stayed gone, the more I convinced myself you were better off without me." His voice cracked then, not from weakness, but from the brutal honesty of looking into the eyes of his daughter and finally telling the truth. "And by the time I realized I was wrong, you were already living the years I should have been part of. That's not your fault. That's mine. All of it." He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just stood there, exposed and human, owning the truth with nothing but the broken humility of a man who had run too far for too long. Ellie didn't say another word. As soon as the silence settled after his confession, she turned and bolted through the doorway, her small feet pounding against the wooden floor, and then the porch steps disappearing into the fading light that stretched across the open field behind the house. The screen door slammed shut behind her, echoing through the stillness like the snap of a breaking heart. James didn't follow. He didn't call after her. He simply stood there for a moment, frozen, before slowly walking to the porch and sitting down on the top step. His hands trembled slightly as he rested his elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where her silhouette had vanished. He could see the tall grass bending in the wind, the soft ripple of summer air whispering through the field. But she was gone from sight. Still he stayed. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun dropped lower, casting everything in a golden hue that softened the edges of the world. James didn't move. He didn't look at his watch. There was no timeline anymore, no strategy to follow, just patience, just presence. For once in his life, he didn't try to fix things, didn't try to control the outcome. He simply waited, knowing this wasn't something he could chase down or force open. She needed space to feel her fury, her betrayal, her confusion, and he would honor that, even if it meant waiting in silence for 100 sunsets. Because after everything he had missed, this, just sitting and waiting, was the least he could do. The sky had shifted from golden to a deep, dusky blue, stars beginning to pierce through the darkening veil when James heard the soft crunch of grass behind him. He didn't turn, he didn't dare hope, but his breath caught in his chest. A moment later, small footsteps climbed the porch stairs with quiet hesitation. Ellie said nothing as she approached. She didn't look at him, didn't touch him, didn't offer words of comfort or absolution. She simply sat down beside him, cross-legged, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweatshirt, eyes staring straight ahead into the darkened field. The silence between them was thick with everything that hadn't been said. Every missed birthday, every tear, every night she had wondered where he was and why he wasn't there. James kept his eyes down, blinking hard, afraid that one look might shatter the fragile moment they now occupied. Ellie didn't speak because there was nothing to say, yet no apology that could erase 10 years, no answer that could make it all right. But her presence beside him said something else entirely. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a beginning. A choice not to walk away. She had run to clear the pain, to scream it into the wind, but she had come back not for him, not yet, but for herself, to see if he would still be there. And he was. James didn't reach out. He didn't push. He just sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, letting the silence cradle them both. In that stillness, with only the sound of crickets and distant wind, something shifted, fragile and barely visible but real. A thread was forming. A thread strong enough to hold weight one day. The storm rolled in like a freight train from the east, heavy black clouds swallowing the sun, turning late afternoon into sudden night. The wind howled through the fields, bending trees, rattling shutters, and whipping dirt into the air as James looked up from the porch and saw it coming fast and unforgiving. Without thinking, he dropped the hammer in his hand, grabbed the tarp he'd been working with, and secured it tightly across the half-repaired section of the roof. Rain began to spit from the sky in sharp, icy drops, and lightning lit up the horizon with jagged veins of white fire. Thunder followed instantly, deep and violent. Inside the house trembled with every crack of the sky. Grace was trying to close the kitchen windows, Ellie herding Maisie down the hallway. But it was Jonah who froze halfway down the stairs, his small hands clutched around the banister, eyes wide with silent panic. James saw him through the screen door, his stillness louder than any scream. In 2 strides, James was inside, water dripping from his hair and coat boots slamming against the wood floor as he crossed the room. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He simply wrapped his arms around the boy, pulling him close, feeling the tremble that Jonah couldn't voice, the shudder that traveled through his spine like the thunder itself. The boy didn't fight it. He didn't flinch. He just buried his face into James's chest and held on with all the strength his little body had. And James held him tighter, sinking to the floor beside the stairs as the wind howled louder and the power flickered. He whispered nothing, just held, just stayed. It wasn't the storm outside that mattered now. It was the one inside Jonah. And for the first time, someone was holding him through it, not running, not explaining, not promising, just anchoring. And Jonah, in the quiet of that moment, let himself be held. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, the sound of the storm momentarily drowned by the silence that had settled in her chest as she watched James crouched on the floor with Jonah wrapped in his arms. The boy who hadn't spoken a word to anyone but her and Ellie, the boy who'd spent years retreating into silence and shadow, was now clutching James like a child, afraid the wind might carry him away. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the contours of James's soaked figure. His back hunched protectively, his jaw clenched, as though holding in something too fragile to release. It was not just shelter he was offering Jonah, but something deeper, older, something that had been missing for years, presence. No promises, no explanations, just the raw, quiet power of being there. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected this, not from him. Not from the man who once walked away without looking back. She felt the storm move through her, but it wasn't the wind or the rain. It was the way her past and present collided in that fragile, flickering image. Slowly, without a word, she stepped closer, barefoot on the creaky floorboards, every step heavy with memory. She crouched beside them, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out, not to pull Jonah away, not to reclaim something lost, but simply to acknowledge the moment that was happening, real and unscripted. Her fingers touched James's shoulder lightly at first, as if testing whether the moment could bear it. He didn't move, didn't turn, but she felt the breath hitch in his chest beneath her hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something recognition, maybe. A silent admission that for this one moment he had stayed, and she had seen it. Not as Grace the mother, not as Grace the woman left behind, but as Grace the witness to a man who in the middle of a storm chose not to run. There were no words spoken in the dim flickering light of the living room, only the soft crackle of thunder in the distance, the slow tick of the kitchen clock, and the rhythmic rise and fall of Jonah's breathing as he curled closer into James's chest. Grace sat beside them, her hand still resting gently on James's shoulder. Not out of obligation, not even out of forgiveness, but because something in her had steadied. The storm had not passed, not outside, and not within. But for the first time in years, her hands weren't shaking. She looked down at her fingers, surprised by the calm that had replaced the tremble that so often betrayed her, even when her voice did not. It wasn't peace, not quite. It was more fragile than that, more fleeting, but it was real. James hadn't looked up, hadn't tried to speak or explain or ask for anything. He simply held the boy he had once left behind, shielding him from a storm far greater than wind or rain. And somehow that act, silent, instinctive, was louder than all the apologies he never said. Grace's eyes moved across the room to the sketch still pinned to the wall, Ellie's drawing of the 3 children and the man who stood apart from them. It was still true in some ways. There was still distance. But now there was also a moment where that distance had been crossed without a word. Her hand, once clenched in memory and resentment, now lay flat and still against James's back, not offering affection, but not withholding presence either. For the first time in a decade, she did not feel like she was the only adult in the house, holding it all together. The silence was thick, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was full of breath of emotion, too fragile to be spoken aloud, and of something beginning to take shape. Not reconciliation, not yet, but maybe the first moment they all simply stayed. That night, long after the children had gone to bed and the house had fallen into a hush so deep it felt sacred, James sat alone at the kitchen table with only a dim lamp and the sound of crickets outside. He unfolded 3 sheets of paper, each one trembling slightly in his hands, not from cold, but from the weight of what he had to say. He began with Ellie. He didn't try to explain himself. He simply told her that he had missed her first day of school, her first lost tooth the first time she played her violin. He wrote, "I wasn't there, and that's on me. I see you now, and I am sorry. You don't have to forgive me, but I needed you to know the truth." For Jonah, he kept the words soft, few, like the boy himself. "You don't speak much, and that's okay. You don't owe me anything. I just want you to know I'm listening now, even to the quiet." And for Maisie, he wrote with a tenderness that broke his own heart. "You asked if I was your dad. I still don't know how to answer that in a way that doesn't sound like a wish. I left before you even knew how to say my name, and yet you looked at me like I might still be someone worth asking." Each letter was different, honest and stripped of ego. There were no promises, no expectations. Only 3 folded pages of truth placed silently at the edge of each child's pillow like small offerings in the dark. James moved through the dim hallway like a man carrying something sacred, holding the 3 folded letters in his hand, as though they might dissolve if gripped too tightly. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of wood settling beneath his feet and the faint hum of wind against the windows. He paused first at Ellie's door, already ajar just slightly, and peeked in. She was curled up on her side, her brow furrowed even in sleep, clutching a pencil in one hand, as if she had been drawing before sleep overtook her. He stepped quietly inside, his breath caught in his throat, and placed the letter gently at the corner of her pillow, careful not to brush her hair or disturb her rest. Then he moved to Jonah's room, where the boy lay on his back, arms crossed over his chest like a soldier on silent guard. James knelt beside the bed, lowered the letter slowly onto the pillow, and looked at his son trying to memorize the soft rhythm of his breathing. Finally, he reached Maisie's room, the smallest of the 3. She was half beneath the blankets, half out, her foot sticking into the air, her favorite stuffed bear askew beside her. James smiled just faintly and placed her letter not on the pillow, but inside the bear's small fabric pouch, tucked where her hand might find it in the morning. He didn't say anything, didn't linger, didn't pray to be forgiven. He simply moved through the quiet house, letting the weight of those pages speak where words had long ago failed. Ellie found the letter just after dawn, tucked neatly at the edge of her pillow beneath the corner of her sketchbook. At first, she thought it was one of her own drawings misplaced during the night, but the envelope was too clean, too intentional, and her name was written in a hand she recognized from fragments of memory. Shaky, unsure, but familiar in the way a forgotten melody tugs at something buried. She sat up the house, still silent, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the page. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. There were no grand justifications or hopeful promises. Just the raw truth of a man who had once run, now standing still, acknowledging every ache he'd caused without asking her to let it go. "I wasn't there when you needed me," it read in part, "and I can't undo that. But I see you now. I see how strong you've become, not because of me, but in spite of me. I don't deserve your kindness, Ellie, but I needed you to know I never stopped carrying the absence of you." Her eyes blurred before she reached the last line, and as she pressed her hand against her chest, a single tear slipped onto the corner of the page, then another falling in heavy silence onto the unfinished sketch on her lap, a drawing of 3 children under a wide tree space still left between them, and the man she hadn't yet decided whether to draw. Jonah didn't say anything when he found the letter beneath his pillow. He simply stared at it for a long time, his small hands tracing the edge of the envelope, as if unsure whether it was safe to open something so fragile, so personal. His mother was in the kitchen, the sound of the kettle rising in the background like a distant storm, but Jonah remained still, hunched on the edge of his bed, with the letter cradled against his chest. When he finally unfolded it, he read every word, slowly, lips moving without sound, eyes flickering with something unreadable, half recognition, half caution. The letter didn't ask him to speak. It didn't tell him to forgive. It only said, "I see you, Jonah, even in silence, even in shadows, and I wish I had stayed long enough to hear what you never said." That line stayed with him. He folded the paper precisely along its creases, walked to the corner of his room where an old wooden box sat beneath a stack of books and broken crayons. His quiet collection of treasures, feathers, bottle caps, a paper airplane Ellie once made a button from his mother's coat. He opened the box, gently placed the letter inside like it was made of glass, then clicked the little brass lock shut with careful finality. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just held the box against his chest for a long time, as if storing the memory not in his mind but somewhere deeper, somewhere protected, somewhere only he could find again when he was ready. Maisie didn't knock, didn't speak, didn't ask permission. She just padded barefoot across the creaky floorboards of the old house, dragging her frayed blanket behind her like a tale of silence until she reached the porch where James sat staring out at the darkened sky. He didn't hear her at first, not until he felt the tiny weight press against his sidearms, wrapping tightly around his waist face, burying itself beneath his jacket, as if trying to disappear into the space where breath met heartbeat. James froze, afraid to move, afraid that if he did, the moment might shatter. Then in the quietest whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for wind brushing through the trees, Maisie said it. "Beau," just that one word. Nothing more. And yet everything changed. He felt it land somewhere deep in his chest like a bell rung, underwater, slow and heavy and impossible to ignore. He didn't speak, he couldn't, but his arm wrapped gently around her small back, pulling her close, anchoring them both in a silence fuller than sound. She didn't cry. She didn't explain. She just held on as if her little body had finally found the answer to a question it had never been able to ask. For James, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a clean slate. But it was something just as rare a beginning, spoken not in promises, but in the single word he'd never dared hope to hear again. The scent of pine filled the small living room, mixing with the faint smell of cinnamon from the kitchen and the crisp December air that snuck in through the cracked window. The Christmas tree stood awkwardly at first, slightly crooked, its branches uneven and wild, just like the family gathered around it. But no one seemed to mind. Grace handed out the dusty box of old ornaments while Maisie clapped her hands and spun in circles holding a glittery star that had lost one of its points. Jonah sat cross-legged near the base, quietly inspecting a wooden reindeer with a broken leg, while Ellie stood near the window, arms crossed but eyes watching everything, especially him. James stood beside the tree, unsure of his place, hands hovering midair until Maisie tugged his arm and said, "You put this one, Daddy. It's heavy." Her voice was casual, like it had always been that way, like he'd always been here. Grace caught his eye for a second, just long enough for him to know it mattered. He knelt down beside Jonah, helping him tie a ribbon through a cracked bell. They didn't speak, but the boy didn't pull away. That was enough. They worked slowly, carefully, laughing, when the tree tilted after Jonah leaned too hard against it. Ellie eventually walked over, and without a word handed James a fragile glass ornament shaped like a snowflake. He didn't miss the way her fingers trembled, or the way she avoided his eyes, but he took it gently, like it was the most precious thing he'd ever held, and placed it high on a branch near the top. When they finished, Grace plugged in the lights, and the whole tree glowed unevenly but beautifully. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, James stood beneath a tree, not as a visitor, not as a stranger on the porch, but as part of the picture, part of the chaos, part of a Christmas that finally softly had a father in it. Grace stood by the archway, camera in hand, half smiling as she adjusted the focus and tried to frame the shot just right. The kids were gathered around the Christmas tree, Maisie sitting proudly in front with the crooked star she'd insisted on placing herself. Jonah kneeling beside a stack of wrapped boxes with his quiet, careful gaze turned toward the lights, and Ellie standing off to the side, arms gently crossed but not retreating like she used to. And there was James somehow in the middle of it all, caught in motion, one hand still holding a piece of ribbon Maisie had flung at him, the other brushing Jonah's shoulder instinctively to steady him. Grace hesitated, her finger hovering above the shutter. It was almost perfect, this stillness wrapped in movement, this portrait of something that had taken months of silence, broken trust, and slow, uncertain steps to become real. But just as she pressed the button, James turned his head, looked at her through the blur of tinsel and blinking lights, and smiled, not broadly, but with that quiet, knowing kind of smile that said he saw her, remembered everything she'd held together when he was gone, everything she'd become without him. Then, before she could lower the camera, he stepped forward, crossed the room in 3 strides, and gently reached for her wrist. "No more pictures without you," he murmured, and the words were simple, but firm. Grace shook her head lightly as if to protest, but her feet didn't move. Her hand didn't pull away. And when James raised the camera and turned it back toward the tree, positioning it on a timer and resting it on a shelf of books, he kept her close. The click came 10 seconds later, just enough time for Ellie to glance over, for Jonah to sit up straighter, for Maisie to shout, "Say candy canes," and for James to slide his arm around Grace's shoulders like it had never left. In that frame, captured quietly under blinking lights, there was no past tense, no if-onlys, just a woman who had carried too much, a man who had finally shown up, and a family beginning, finally to believe in the shape of together. The photo wasn't perfect. Jonah's eyes were half closed, caught mid-blink as the camera flashed. Maisie's shirt was untucked and smeared with hot chocolate she'd spilled 10 minutes earlier and forgotten. Ellie had a frown tugging at the corner of her lips. Not quite a scowl, but not yet a smile. And James, though trying to sit still, had one arm reaching out awkwardly as if unsure whether to wrap it around Grace's waist or rest it on the back of the couch. The lights on the Christmas tree were slightly uneven, the top branch sagging from the weight of too many handmade ornaments that didn't match, and the garland kept slipping down because Jonah had been too quiet to ask for help and tried to do it himself. And yet when the photo printed from the old wireless machine on the corner table and slid into Grace's hand, there was something about it that stopped her. She didn't blink, didn't adjust it, didn't reach to crop the edges or fix the lighting, because it was real. It was messy, imperfect, unsure, and exactly what it needed to be. For the first time in years, there wasn't silence that felt sharp. There were voices, footsteps, chaos, a spilled cup, a shouted name, a swing creaking outside with snow gathering on its ropes, and James' present flawed learning where he fit in this frame that used to have a gap shaped like him. This wasn't a fairy tale picture frozen and glossy. It was a living one. It had fingerprints on the edges and a soft tear where Maisie tried to tape it to the fridge and missed. But that image with all its brokenness and clumsy angles was a truth none of them had dared to imagine months ago. A family stitched together not by perfection, but by the choice to stay. And in that choice, silent, daily, unremarkable, was the beginning of something stronger than forgiveness. It was love, not loud or grand, but real. The email sat unread for 3 days, its subject line glowing like a whisper from another life. "We'd love to have you back, James." It came from the board of directors, cloaked in polished words and promises of restored reputation, flexible terms, even partial remote options. They didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. The company missed him, needed him, and was willing to pretend the last 8 years were a sabbatical, not abandonment. He read it on the porch just before dawn, with Jonah still curled up inside and the scent of coffee graces drifting through the half-cracked window. For a moment the old hunger stirred in his chest, the one that once throbbed for relevance power, the thrill of decisive rooms and billion-dollar stakes. He pictured the skyline, the glass offices, the silent admiration that came with his name etched into elevator panels. But then he looked out at the frost-covered swing set, still holding a faint imprint from Maisie's tiny boots. He thought of Jonah's fragile trust, slowly mending Ellie's wary glances, softening the quiet rhythm of mornings that didn't need status to feel full. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, poured 2 mugs, and placed one where Grace would find it. Then he sat at the old wooden table, opened his laptop, and typed just 8 words, "Thank you. But I'm exactly where I belong." No explanation, no resume. Just a closing of one door, so another, the one creaking open upstairs where a child stirred in sleep, could remain wide open. Because for the first time in his life, James Whitmore chose presence over prestige. And it felt like peace. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and bathed the kitchen in a soft amber hue, Ellie sat quietly at the table, pencil in hand, but drawing nothing. James was rinsing dishes at the sink, humming a tune he used to play on the piano when she spoke, her voice low, almost cautious, like she wasn't sure if the question was allowed. "Why didn't you go?" The sound of water stopped, but James didn't turn immediately. He dried his hands slowly, deliberately, then walked over and pulled out the chair across from her. She didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the blank page, like she was trying to prepare herself for a disappointment she already expected. James studied her, the slope of her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched the pencil too tightly, as if bracing. "Because I missed too many things already," he said, the words rough but steady. "Your first words, your first day of school. That time your mom got sick and you had to be strong. I wasn't there. Not once. Not for any of it." Ellie's eyes flickered up for the first time, but she said nothing. "They offered me a seat at a long table in a tall building full of important people." James continued, "But none of them ever drew me pictures. None of them ever forgave me just by sitting next to me." There was silence between them, thick but not heavy. She blinked, then finally whispered, "I didn't say I forgave you." James nodded gently. "I know," he said. "But you asked. And that's more than I deserve." And still neither of them moved, but something in the quiet had shifted. James didn't answer Ellie's question right away. He looked at her. Really looked. Not just at her face, which carried so much more than a child her age should have to hold, but at the space between them, the years that had carved silence and distance, and yet somehow led back to this table, this moment. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, as if every word he was about to say needed to be earned. "Because I'm exactly where I need to be," he said finally, his voice quiet but unwavering. Ellie frowned, not in anger, but in the way children do when they don't understand something that feels like it matters. James leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the worn wood between them. I spent so many years thinking where I belonged was out there. Chasing meetings, building towers, flying first-class seats to places that never felt like home. But none of that ever asked me to stay. None of it ever needed me, not in the way you do. Not in the way your brother holds my hand when he's half asleep. Not in the way Maisie called me dad for the first time and then acted like it was no big deal. Not even in the way you get mad at me for the years I missed, because even that means you cared enough to be hurt. His eyes didn't leave hers. This house doesn't have a corner office or a paycheck, but it has mornings I get to make breakfast, and nights where someone leaves their socks under the couch, and a girl who used to pretend I didn't exist, now asking why I chose to stay. That's why I'm here, Ellie. Because for the first time in my life, I'm in the only place that ever needed me to stay. Dinner that evening was simple grilled cheese tomato soup and a few sliced apples in the middle of the table, but something about the way it was laid out made it feel like a feast. No one said much. The clatter of spoons against bowls, the soft hum of the old ceiling fan, and the creak of wooden chairs as they shifted were the only sounds in the room. But the silence wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't the kind that used to stretch between them like a wall. It was warm like a worn quilt shared by 5 people who had learned to sit quietly without feeling apart. James sat at one end, a dish towel still slung over his shoulder from the kitchen, his eyes drifting from face to face. Grace passed Jonah another slice of apple, brushing her thumb against his cheek without a word. Maisie dipped her sandwich into the soup and grinned when it fell apart in the bowl, giggling into her hands like it was the funniest thing in the world. And Ellie caught James looking at her, rolled her eyes like only a teenager could, but the edges of her mouth lifted into something small and real. Then Jonah laughed, not at anything in particular, just a soft, bright sound that escaped without warning. That was all it took. One laugh, and suddenly the table was full of them. Maisie's high-pitched squeal, Ellie's stifled snort, even Grace's quiet chuckle as she shook her head. James didn't laugh out loud, but he smiled the way a man does when he realizes he's exactly where he's supposed to be. No one said a word, but every single person at that table knew something had shifted. Something had settled. They were a family now, not perfect, not polished, but finally undeniably together. One soft spring morning, the kind that carried the smell of damp soil and fresh hope, James stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, not expecting anything more than the usual hush of early light and the distant chatter of birds in the trees. But as he rounded the corner of the railing, he saw Ellie. She was sitting cross-legged on the wooden steps, a sketch pad balanced on her knees, completely absorbed in her drawing. The light caught the edge of her pencil as it moved with quiet intention, shaping lines with a certainty that surprised him. He stayed still, careful not to break the moment, but she glanced up, briefly saw him, and didn't flinch, didn't pull the page away like she used to. She just looked at him, expression unreadable, and then returned to her sketching. After a minute, curiosity pulled him closer. He stepped softly and tilted his head just enough to catch a glimpse of the paper. It was a portrait, a family, 3 kids, a woman, and right in the center him. Not just drawn in, but centered with Ellie's strokes, giving his face a gentleness he wasn't sure he deserved. For a moment, James forgot how to breathe. He said nothing. She said nothing. But in that quiet space between them, something old healed just a little more. The screen door creaked softly behind him, a familiar sound now, one that no longer made him tense. James turned slightly at the sound of footsteps, slow and steady, and there was Jonah, barefoot, tousled hair, still in his faded pajamas, holding a warm ceramic mug in both hands, like it was something sacred. Without a word, the boy walked over and held it out. It was James's mug, the chipped one with the faded blue rim, the one he always used but never asked for. James took it gently, their fingers brushing for a second. Jonah didn't meet his eyes, but he stood there close, solid, not hiding. James whispered, "Thanks, buddy." But Jonah just gave a small nod and sat on the top porch step next to Ellie, knees drawn up to his chest. There was no ceremony, no dramatic shift, only the quiet act of a boy bringing his father a cup of coffee on a spring morning. And for James, that single gesture held more weight than any boardroom deal or scripted apology. It was trust earned not through words but through presence time and the quiet mending of what once was broken. From inside the house, the scent of warm biscuits and scrambled eggs drifted through the screen door just moments before Grace's voice floated out clear and soft, but full of something that only time and quiet forgiveness could carry. "Breakfast's ready," she called, not shouting, just enough to reach them where they sat on the porch. James froze for half a second, not because of the words themselves, but because of the tone, familiar, worn in, almost domestic. It wasn't an invitation dressed up in caution. It wasn't guarded like the early days or said with a wall of distance. It was simple, steady, like he belonged there. Ellie glanced at him briefly as if checking how he'd react, but didn't say anything, just kept sketching the outline of a sun rising in her drawing. Jonah didn't move yet either, but he looked toward the door, ears perked like a child learning what safety sounds like. James let the warmth of the coffee cup seep into his hands as he nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting. Not quite a smile, more like the soft beginning of one. Grace's voice echoing from a kitchen he once thought he'd never see again was a quiet kind of miracle. James stood up slowly, as if the weight of the morning, of the years he had lost and the moments he was now allowed to step into, was something sacred, something not to be rushed. He glanced once more at Ellie, who didn't look back, but didn't flinch either, still drawing her quiet world onto paper with him now penciled in. He let his hand rest briefly on Jonah's shoulder, a silent gesture that said more than words could manage, then turned and walked toward the open door. The wood beneath his feet creaked gently, familiar and new all at once. He passed the swing he had repaired, the nail that had drawn blood now rusted into memory, the chipped paint he hadn't yet sanded, the life still unfinished but beginning. As he crossed the threshold, he felt the warmth of the kitchen wrap around him like a worn blanket, and the sound of Grace moving about, silverware, clinking plates settling, felt like music he once forgot how to hear. There was no applause for his return, no grand declaration of welcome. Just the smell of food, the steam curling from a kettle, and the soft murmur of a home slowly remembering how to hold him. He stepped fully into the house, and in that quiet, unremarkable motion, something shifted, not in the walls or in the air, but in the way the room held him. There was no hesitation in his steps now, no careful glancing around to see if he belonged, no pause at the edge of the hallway where a guest might stop to wait for permission. The coffee Jonah had given him still warmed his palm, not as a token of politeness, but as something earned, something understood. The picture Ellie was drawing still sat unfinished on the porch, but she had placed him in the center, not an observer, not on the edge, but centered between the figures of the family she knew. Grace's voice from the kitchen hadn't carried the distance of formality. It had wrapped around his name even when it hadn't spoken it. The chair at the table wasn't just available, it was his. He didn't ask to sit. He didn't need to. As he pulled it out and sat down, no one looked up in surprise. No one offered him a plate as if he were visiting. The silence, the ease, the rhythm of the morning, they all said the same quiet truth: he was no longer a visitor. He was home. He was no longer on the outside looking in, no longer the shadow hovering at the edge of their lives with guilt stitched into every glance. He was part of the living, breathing fabric of the family now. Not because someone declared it or wrote it down, but because every small moment had woven him in. The way Jonah leaned his head against James's arm while reaching for toast, the way Maisie handed him her napkin like it was the most natural thing in the world, the way Ellie, though still quiet and cautious, didn't flinch when he poured her orange juice, all spoke louder than any grand gesture. Even Grace, moving around the kitchen with a lightness that hadn't been there months ago, let her hand rest for a second on his back as she passed, brief, ordinary, but full of meaning. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet truth that had grown between them day after day, rainstorm after drawing, silence after word. He had been tested not by dramatic trials, but by the slow demand of presence, the ache of waiting, the humility of being there without expecting anything in return. And somehow by staying, by showing up again and again with open hands and no expectations, he had become theirs, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. He belonged. Sometimes life doesn't give us a second chance wrapped in a perfect bow. It gives us silence, distance, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, showing up again might matter. James didn't return to rewrite the past, he came back to be present in the now. And that's the heart of this story. In the real world, we often wait for the right time to mend relationships, to say, "I'm sorry," or to become the person someone needs. But healing doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for presence. You can't undo the years you were absent, but you can choose today to be present, to listen, to stay. Whether you're a parent who walked away a child carrying questions, or someone standing at the edge of forgiveness, know this: consistency matters more than grand gestures. Trust is rebuilt not in declarations, but in breakfast tables, hand-drawn pictures, and coffee cups passed without words. It's in choosing to stay when it's easier to leave. So if there's someone in your life you've drifted from, someone you hurt, or someone you miss, maybe now is the time. Write the letter. Make the call. Sit beside them without needing to be praised. Just be there. And for those still waiting, know that your quiet strength speaks louder than you think. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild trust or welcome someone back after a long absence? Share your experience below, we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to save this video if it moved you, subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to show up.